Brendan, can I ask you a question in the hall?
Yeah. Why do you want to ask it here?
You can say it now. It's okay. Keep saying it. So I'm gonna need 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in the Dropbox too.
Yeah, the Dropbox. So
Yeah, okay.
I'm Jed. MJ. I flow in whatever color the hotel pen is.
I respect that.
That's really good.
I don't get how you flow in one color. I feel like that'd be really hard.
I flow in one pencil. Actually, no, I flow in two pencils.
That's disgusting. That's not how it works.
Whatever you
One
do.
mechanical pencil, one really like,
That'd be awesome.
yeah.
Okay.
Everybody good?
Yeah. Okay.
Advantage one is water pollution, accepting campus or sites causing massive water pollution, driving dead zones, 20 water pollution waters, or having water sources and concentrating in areas, multiple states, living worse because it's causing harmful health effects, other physical climate issues, agricultural polluted water, source of pressure animals and change of plastic, hard overall, water quality review campus, emissions, campus, melting of the permit, conservation, appreciation, pilot water, pollution, it carries beer from the water system, mark system, causing grace, and it's basically creating a people vision, specifically, it's caused high nutrition, digestion, phosphorus, sugar, that's the application of around 50% of it. 40% phosphorus complexity of track for mass extinction, but the plan is sufficient to reverse it. Guaranteed 18 number of blocks as well as the extinction result fertilizer beheaded from beings roughly that is appearing Gulf Mexico is key projections of for enough for sufficient LSU 18 decimal in the Gulf Mexico technological bacteria the world temperature desatured and the opportunity to success is perfect for the national phosphorus and create national stress and many conditions humans by the local changes to opportunity to correctly raise quality saturation to reinforce their scientific reasons prepared for extinction. Brandon 18 notifications as public subsidies with oxygen should be very hypoxia is one with the promise of just like the extinction independently, forcing the industry to internalize the cost of water pollution. Ignites a boom in competitive innovation for 20 icons of the farmer loss of electrons, including city regulation of agricultural cost pollution, examples of examples of innovation, tech reduce pollution, while competition, medical similar to several spurring competition to example industry to displace polluting pollution water because of access to supply because of electronic station based also of the cheap electronic cost of studies outside of these pollution reducing sciences, not make financial regulation to enforce consultation to the level for the best breaking capital water secret banks of financial versus are well documented innovation research observers and value grouping research activities using your cost material regulation trees cost grouping with resource efficiency and product quality difference of our performance can be produced and environmental friendly products failure to be organized use ag and shoe will cause collapse kill and 20 security results sporting factors security efficiency security as for product no longer as able to enforce resource service systems advanced quality to be restructured policy to be created itself for companies and water efficiency for food technique creating efficiency for every water for water skyrocketing prices food imports global forecast law. In 17, we think those factors is imposed with routes of budget security demonstration. Is the impulsive population during conflict strong volatility can be correlated to price of self government as a question purposes ability to use made for purpose. Emerging market research first working to exact first the public being expressed to be produces your shooting wars goes nuclear clock as well. Food security result work on the regional short wars of follow. As a research celebration as a strict weekly war the plan now is usually increases food transport about regular concentrated animal feed operations in the United States because doing so for the purposes of the Clean Water Act. Universal food transport is key to the 15. Water utility keeps operating for the course action contracts from those with the health government national producers and most great farmers congress about EPA for the streams for that and to use for infrastructure efficiency for and then keep protecting great resources with the team with the resources health stream and disclosure who know that their water undercover can be implemented. I never started my timer.
I have 5 minutes left.
Exactly 5?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll start in 1 second. Sorry about that. Okay. Advantage 2 is precedent. The court's decision report produces Mr. AP authority to regulate cave pollution. They ignored the stated purpose of the Clean Water Act interpreting sexual plan clarifies the courts must prioritize the purpose of the statute, not the reading of the text by alone. Any court finding CBB such as the experts courts of congressional head can propose the construction of fishery such was water board we have water given knowledge for this resolution to the courts appeals for the zero for police practice decision here to structure the sexual interpretation every director raising gives water as one except the raising water but successfully thanks for listening to the consensus interpretation based on the basis for water to be authority receives things of the act purpose consider statements that result decision of the plan clarifies long-standing Supreme Court practices defining it in active purpose against sexual interpretation where the active sex statute explicitly defines its overall purpose. Act 19. We can interpret statute to get to the purpose for the text for the purposes of interpretation because the purposes included interpretation is with the kind of self-verification common opportunity to include purposes of purpose candidate was because of implication view of each action the conservative embracing a new better text interpretation cherry picking certain words claiming they're ambiguous and interpreting congressional time this breaks down the administrative state and environmental statutes extinction concept. Hypertext is a planning research projects. This is like meeting where other abstract concepts result in system hypertext where the effects by the course different courses for reasonable interpretation of things course open this produces color shots for example the different conditions of state these things this is all there to most cross triggers national transformation and values climate change as binding has concluded education water national consider their pollution they can organize the conclusion here to do like hospital and social hypertext is able to pursue education research for your generally hypertext skills given result to harmful goals increase share the local solutions to results to be catastrophic hypertext to result in implications of PCBA or data for change for the laws as a whole. Effective administrative state is key to everything. Poster 17. The structure government people think the markets workers the 8 years of law is the deal of Congress comes to slowly regulation can be for Congress to market city house getting change regulatory markets market seven health farms part of the service substance of the people project to the last crisis regulatory food drugs nuclear penetration is not it's extinction varied in not. Far as just survival of the country possibilities of cultural services social control administration strength constitution and straight together key back to the cultural history and possible government to several context of the version of campus with the one of the proposition world struggle of the world hypertextualist rest Rex path system. Let me in 20. Federal work is ignoring the work of the possible to help the business with the idea of claims, defense against the business, other parts thinking of claim construction to the claim part of the time potential of the claim construction of the rules and comes to the other process. But there's one person that's the federal courts describe the permission to circulate the result of confusion, just pointing the opposite direction as the degree of evidence and rules of example, allegedly found to claim the court could be the claim as was reflected in the court review on the division of self-nuclear war and the range of the excellence of 16. Greater global government should be taken against antagonism and globalization of exertion and nuclear war genesis, disease, representation, and robotic activity, which is rapid innovation costs of the effect of the idea of the law, the decision part of the the international idea can be represented by critical solutions saying that the negotiation of this like securities and cycle in solution around the globe depending on the structure stable IP rights establishing statutes and regulations will be construed by their enacted purpose preambles, preserve sufficient flexibility, provides greater predictability to regulate the parties. Section 13. With regulations pertaining to economic interpretation practices, I talk about all principal methods to the direct version of the starting to as well as the issues to interpret the abilities to construct the connection be interpreted for the basis purpose and interpret purposely as actually so that authority business also got issues to actually interpret the purpose of the construction for the observed basis for rights to appreciate the more and noticing consulting reducing as we are running the construction also the regulation means holding the industry to construction the business of the industry so justification is good establishing some constraints on the range of personal interpretation is key to getting issues in schools credibly convinced regular regime is the LCC. Addition to the different from credible federal official advantage age so time the concept of the different account of the project is making the decision to regular cost of regular furniture less volatility less against your obligation to the regulation creating a better depth to each concept figures and shows all the doctor again change the schema regulating commercial target that's harder and 18 strategies keepers ability to second strategies potential strategies cost of strategies to equal size giving these personal control was creating research actions recognizing for opportunities the market the last one it's process of identification and revenue software criteria we see on a version of technology regulation which is part of the teacher the course practice against large but large capability of a regime effective regime second is the key to extinction that's hedging article 17. Meteor comes out of the separate calculation without change the rules of course more people the be able to also the ability to walk ourselves and change civilization measuring the environment biology many intelligent AI has the potential to unlock progress because use of solid hardware with the use of automatic concept to be greater than extras with the technology to a few causes events causing extra possible candidates to the record these are and key to the construction of the spirit in 18 the these parts are making harder to not do any significant Ewok is marked inject significant uncertainty.
Okay, cool. You good?
Yes.
Awesome. So I want to talk about the deoxygenation scenario of the Brennan evidence about global hypoxia. How does the AF resolve that?
LSU evidence says the dead zone forming in the Gulf of Mexico is sufficient condition to resolve it because it's the fastest growing dead zone in the world.
Okay. So the LSU evidence says that the Gulf zone or the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is bad. Where does it say that that resolves other dead zones?
I mean, I assume the all cause is going to be like the Arab Gulf dead zone. LSU evidence says the Gulf of Mexico is worse because it's growing faster. We can also read a card later that's like that is a key biodiverse region and the other large dead zone is not in that. But
okay, to be fair, I'm not talking about just like one other dead zone. The Brennan card that you read and the Carrington card are just like about global hypoxia being bad.
No, I think our cards are reverse causal. Carrington is about like empirical practices where the app was adopted on a small scale in like one state. It said that was sufficient to clean up the
Okay,
ocean.
where is the Carrington evidence talking about empirical practices?
I might have been referring to the wrong card, but the
so the bottom of
better
that
farm
card is
practices
just like
led to dead zones. Better farm practices led to dead zones disappearing. That was the last
yeah,
line.
in like the Chesapeake Bay in the like in a river in the UK. Neither of the like obviously those examples disprove that there is a spillover to like global dead zones.
I think all of the stuff that comes out of the Mississippi Delta is significantly worse than like some random river in the Chesapeake Bay. And we've read evidence that resolving that dead zone is sufficient. So
You haven't read evidence that says resolving that dead zone is sufficient, but okay. The evidence also talks about like sewage. It talks about manure from CAFOs, but then also talks about sewage and other fertilizer pollution.
Yeah.
How do you resolve those types of pollutants?
the app would require a permit for discharging those as well.
From CAFOs,
Yes.
these types of pollutants are like about fertilizing crops.
That's like our Finney evidence says that most of those pollutants come from CAFOs because
No, it
they're big
doesn't.
industrial ag.
That's-
Yes, it does.
The Finney evidence talks about manure from CAFOs as an example, and then says that
It says
there's
that
like fertilization of crops and other.
it says CAFOs are bad environmentally because they are more likely to engage in industrial dumping practices. Like small farms are not dumping mass amounts of nitrogen into.
So small farms don't do that. Sure.
They do some pollution, but it's nowhere near the scale of
Yeah.
big CAFO operations.
I want to talk about the ag scenario. The CASLA evidence lists all these like scenarios for war, but isn't talking about where does it say that those are like the result of food insecurity. It seems to be saying that those are a bunch of existential threats, and then it says food security is different.
No, it says that like what things are you talking about in that?
Like I mean, where it says like at the top where it's like.
Okay, I'm setting up now.
Sure.
7 off, advantage 2, advantage 1. Okay.
MJ, I thought you said you were slow today.
Some of these off are not long.
Oh.
So long. Get ready. They're so long.
It's really more like 6 off. It's technically.
Now I'm very confused.
No, it's sorry. I was.
I don't know.
It is
Let's
7 off.
stick with 7, see where we go.
I'm honestly not
Yeah,
sure which
shake
one
that.
is the one that's more like.
Was like, but no, I was answering Ben's thing.
So a
about how-
realistic 6 and a probable 7.
No, it's 7. I was trying to make sure it wasn't Ben said. That was confusing me. Here, you're trading.
Oh yeah.
Okay, sorry. 7 off, advantage 2, advantage 1. Has anyone not gotten it? It seems like everyone's good. Please say something. Okay. First off, T cessation, protection, ban cessation of use, with tag 96, and causing the wrongful protection, conservation, against use, resourceful protection, use, command cessation of use, violation, and cease and use, suspend, anything else, necessarily excels limits and no links for the next fairness, next opposite, the United States Supreme Court should design increase the speed discharge permitting of water feeding or animal feeding operations in the United States on the basis of such for done by judicial deference or reliance interest announced that the existing president regarding the Clean Water Act is no longer reliable and issued no binding dicta that specifically argues for increasing free discharge permitting water and concentrated animal feeding operations because doing so will in the purpose of the Clean Water Act. The United States Federal Judiciary should accept or override challenges about the Clean Water Act and handle issues no binding dicta or working precedent which causes controversy and source follow on fresh states. Unique facilitate change by limiting the undermining stability of which may procure the or produce limits affecting the future which presents opportunity for announcement and is to download or overrule extending one pressure to clean the more havoc than society will tolerate technique make change less disruptive makes it more less comprehensive without change. And next up, of course, certain government the United States federal government should substantially increase the free discharge for any water and concentrated animal animal feeding operations in the United States federal government should supervise jurisdiction of the federal judiciary to review agency rulemaking jurisdiction strict installers for which way this requires record democracy, whereas the Iranian parties intend to supreme this require lower federal courts of jurisdiction. The Constitution clearly permits the jurisdiction to be for remedy to unhealthy situation in which American rules about rights to resolve their political question. Mentioned Democrats took over the heading of the economic catastrophe by the EPA with powers to rule the Supreme Court and delegating to administrative agencies. Congress can use jurisdiction serving the circuit House of Courts. What happens if the Supreme Court declares an action jurisdiction check on constitutionally or federal courts are utterly dependent on political branches that control either the budget or facilities. Congress permanent with those powers while position to be back to the opposition by the courts. Next office being counterpart. The United States federal government should be the regulation of concentrated animal feeding operations in the United States. Chelsea linked to misconduct. Next office ban CAFO's counterplan. The United States federal government should rule that all concentrated animal feeding operations in the United States require a permit to operate with doing so for the purposes of Clean Water Act, permitting monitoring of CAFOs in the United States, establish a national food security strategy, including a limited substantially consider agricultural research and development, institute a national program of research, knowledge transfer, and assistance in developing agricultural capacity abroad, massively invest in the development of agricultural infrastructure, clean irrigation programs, infrastructure wetlands, lastly subsidize on industrial animal farming, livestock, beef, and meat alternatives, substantially increase the development and adoption programs to reduce runoff agricultural strategies, substantially increase restoration of floodplains to capture nutrients, salt food, whereas under 16 import dependence and dimension more sensitive food price volatility in their opportunity to cut for colonization, free dedicated self-care program research, knowledge transfer, and assistance developing agricultural capacity, violence for national governments, and pursuit of price stability, fairly humble food system, provide and press the proactive policy recommendations, including export improvements, strategic grain reserves, and key regions, facilitating commodity hedging by important governments, suggesting export bans, encouraging the adoption of regional food balance sheets, helping our government navigate the transition from general food subsidies and targeted meat tested food assistance and CAFOs, or horrifyingly unethical and unnecessary. AWI noted CAFOs create animals but not as sentient creatures that will find as such stakeholders that greatly the development and horrible behaviors due to providing inflicting foods on their inmates to formulation routinely perform the alternative high welfare fertilized animals waiting for food to have a life free of unnecessary pain and suffering. Next off is stare decisis to claim creates signing precedent that the court should conduct statutes of regular purpose and laws and methodological stare decisis, which is straight to rule law and democracy. Exclusive 19 methodology tells them the process of appropriate determining the acts and justice for particular interpretation is different methodology that seeks to cast a context and establishes measurable methodological stare decisis acts of federal interpretation that promotes the rule of law just acts and defers to the court's methodological approach issued by methodology regularly is problematic that courts in determined purposes will be required to go forward for conference extensive authority and presence and injustice expensive successive methodological or fundamental about the rule of law and democracy self-succinction 2021 democracy and under self-democracy sure medical policy agrees that promotes less real less security stable prosperous the just rate power conflict terrorism and migration lies the democratic institution for secretary and both other sustainable fight education that democratic accountability topics such as violent extreme democracies don't fight each other democracy by terror and demonstrate that open societies can be attacked that solve the world's problems including climate change and stop misconduct optimism is high for recovery and accelerate growth and maintain business confidence is key. That's Castle Instance 46,000 jobs in January showing recovery from the face of pandemic many economists in the White House expectation for a week before it said numbers arrived from earlier estimates for the optimistic job openings just touch on record levels of higher positive sector and how to effectively be positioned in the way that it passes growth and improvement accelerated pace of benefits while it's easy and game restrictions tech industry tremendous lose ground in the global market of course mergers firms shut down they don't imply take a massive economic hit. Columns 21 and game regulation increased costs to restrict results increased costs of increased costs to update equipment interest operation pay administrative costs of various companies worldwide agricultural market producers and governments supposed to regulation gain economic advantages including knowledge changes impact their restrictive regulation for shutdown due to financial difficulties and compliance and post-COVID economic rebound security global diplomacy terms global conflict the EU climate the EU collapse and China's authoritarian dominance is coming 20 the risk of the contest of the EU political consequences post-COVID and risk of the US will retain leadership in global advertising recovery condition with the EU collapse and to trigger escalating conflict that so conflict is the cities for long as China being the first US regaining leadership is convening power being the first enemy significant is likely to be China president advantage. Enacted purposes can limits efforts to agency interpretation facilities strike down regulations for global advantage ways to stack 19. The enacted purposes can operate supervision interpretation that might otherwise seem permissible. The enacted purposes can start application review and incorporate different agency construction under sharp and only with the decision consistent with the enacted purposes consideration of enacted purposes the scenarios for of agency interpretation quality for difference enacted purpose can will have to affect when a regulatory or presidential administration implemented regulatory statute that will send the agency action against it for regulatory purposes and enacted purposes provides the scope of the agency's power and can as well to rein in politically motivated reasoning or judicial reasoning of empirical data that's burning Disclaimer 19. Our results much are optimistic for setting explaining just to rely on the hands are also part of the majority's reasoning just to be the hands of reasonably made no this morning either side the blended reasoning decision about when and how to use it in specific justice consideration why the fear or why the hand in themselves Candidates themselves valuable use of camera lines, which are being by both conservative local justice and reducing results are remarkably consistent with ideological preferences. Candidate not serve as a systemic interpretive guides for lawmakers stands are so adaptable to be and have been invoked to help justify positions that are ideological policy related foundations, water pollution advantage. Ecosystems are resilient. Alternative 21. Coral makers and seagrasses all possess mechanisms of immediate hypoxia and production of oxygen that these species provide with their ability to utilize oxygen for oxygen and microhabitats that have been demonstrated widespread adaptation of hypoxia, fisher become sulfate or certain gulping adaptation while protected even in extreme hypoxia events. Species persistent resulting in communication and complete loss and a billion all causes dead zones, climate change, agriculture, and or sewage fertilization. Number 20. Over fertilization of large numbers of agricultural sewage and burning possibilities of the most important job of those areas of reducing dead zones. Climate warming is is an increasingly important factor which allows the eutrophication of access to global warming and nutrient replacement based on the strength of hypoxia nutrients fuel or fuel pollutant biology that today there are over 700 sites of hypoxia. Global and domestic food production are in the dumps, and there are tons of dumpers in it. 20. Foods modified and defined distribution was declined 60% in developing and developed countries that has significant making all countries with the same liver, classified disruption, cycling, and about 5 factors, all the loss of meal. Vulnerability food related climate disease and experience system events able from various events such as world crisis are involved in that way food prices of food restricting export restriction have negative effects on hard farmers reduce incentives that undermine reputation reduce competence over reducing international trade and pandemic and trigger domino effects export restricting policies push for the world crisis for instance in parts after. This is on the counter plan, like the ban counter plan with both planks. Dead zone plank solved. Item 17. Conservancy is working to tackle runoff of cover crops, reduce tillage, crop rotation, nutrient management for our associated reduce nutrient runoff, restore floodplains with flow water, capture nutrients, otherwise upstream, restore 44,000 acres of floodplain. This works way to restore safe removes as much nutrients as the natural floodplain. So 8 seconds left.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll start with that.
Give me 1 second to get my charger set up because my computer runs on a potato battery and
Yeah, no worries.
it's gonna crash pretty soon.
Okay.
Did you get it first? I just got it.
Cool.
Okay, you good?
Mhm.
Okay. Okay. Dicta counterplan, I guess the whole point of dicta is that it does not apply retroactively. The pork producer's case has already been decided. How would this solve the gap?
I'm a little confused. The Fairchild 68 evidence shows that through non-binding dicta post-decision, they would be able to shape the decision in a way that applies the same precedent, but it doesn't require them overturning stare decisis.
How does this, if this doesn't result in overturning the pork producer's ruling, like what does it do?
I guess there's a distinction. Rather than overturning it via precedent, they would lay out dicta that would encourage courts to go against it, but it wouldn't send a binding precedent that triggers the link that's described in the first piece of evidence in the stare decisis here.
Sure.
It's a distinction between like establishing it in precedent at a federal level versus post-decision, like adding parts of it in like the decision and not incorporating in like not incorporating like a precedent.
Court stripping counterplan, counterplan text seems to indicate the judiciary can't review agency rules. I guess how does this solve all the impacts about courts gutting statutes?
Yeah, it's more uniqueness counterplan. If you try to make arguments about the turn on precedent advantage, it just says that it establishes uniqueness where the courts are not able to sort of control agency regulation or like limit it. I guess
it's just like oh wait, the counterplan is just like no judicial review ever.
It's really limited.
Of what agency decision?
Of
what
agency
exceptions
decision-making,
would there
to be
be?
clear. Yeah, thank you.
What exceptions would there be? Like you said.
It doesn't cite specific exceptions, except it says they would be majorly restricted and no longer able to sort of ideologically control what the agencies are doing.
It would skirt jurisdiction of like reviewing agency decision.
Okay. Ban CAFA's counterplan, what's the net benefit?
Like CAFO's bad stuff.
Wait, what? Oh.
It's the second card.
Harm do both? Question mark?
We think the AF necessitates not banning CAFOs because the
Wait,
counter, or plan text
so-
is substantially increased protection.
Plan text says
Like,
CAFOs cannot exist
we
unless
think
they have a permit. Counterplan says they cannot exist, period. Why is this not Plan
the
Plus?
plan does not say they can't exist unless they get a permit. The plan increases permitting of CAFOs.
It just
We think that
says
is mutually
requires
exclusive.
CAFOs to get the permit more.
I can read the plan text to you. It like clearly says increase permitting of CAFOs.
Yeah,
That is distinct with banning. You cannot
so like,
increase
the fact that
permitting
the
for
counterplan
something
and the
and
plan
also
are
ban it.
two different, what? Okay.
Like
Sure.
legitimately, you couldn't like increase permits for like hydroelectricity and also ban hydroelectricity.
Well, increased permitting just means increase the stringency of requirements and like require people
But
to get a
permits,
permit.
okay, obviously we can get into a debate about like what the exact definition of permitting is, but we believe that increasing permitting implies that it would exist post-AF, even if there are regulations on it. It precludes a ban.
We're gonna take, are we doing 10 minutes?
What we would
I've
do.
done 8 for every other debate, but I don't know what.
We've done, I believe the term is time.
Let's do 10.
Yeah. Okay, so 10 minutes starting now.
Yeah, plans if they're equivalent, they cannot exist. The counter plan says they're equivalent, they cannot exist. Just clearly plan plus.
Wait, so kind of says that.
Counter plan says that in both worlds, they cannot exist. So just clearly plan plus.
Okay.
And it's another institution.
This is also-
Yes.
Oh, can you get blanks on the bench counterplan?
We think it's theoretically legitimate to kick blanks.
It is?
We think it's theoretically legitimate to kick blanks, yeah.
Like all of them?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're confident in this.
It's not like just click on through. Just look at it. Just your hands.
Yes.
Yeah, it's fine.
That's what they do.
Experts or whatever.
You can just-
This is a joke.
Okay.
Wait, sorry.
Stop something. That's true. You can't.
There is, like, this, like, puppet, but that's.
Can't wait, so can't wait.
Yeah,
It's approved in case it's just a recommendation.
Should be fine. Okay, stop right, so. Please. Okay, y'all can start over. There'll be advantage 1, advantage 2, T cessation, the large advantage counter plan, the counter plan, the like one, or actually, yeah, the large advantage counter plan and the stripping counter plan. The like 1 line long counter plan that just bans capos.
First,
No,
The ban right,
Yeah, we should take a second. How much were we at?
I think I know what you mean.
Yeah.
I don't think,
How much prep do we have?
It's 7:30 something.
I believe it's 7:36.
ah,
That is not a thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it also doesn't solve for
Okay, yeah, we'll stop around, right, 7:22.
that's what I think.
Yeah, the one line long counterplan that's like ban regulation of capos.
Wait, you just, for me.
Yeah, I'll start at the top.
Start,
Yeah.
just go down.
Advantage 1, advantage 2, T cessation, the large advantage counterplan, the stripping counterplan, the one line long counterplan that bans regulations of capos, the dicta counterplan, the discon disad, the finding, like the methodological starting decisis, or disad.
Okay, so sorry, do you mind if it's T cessation, the advantage counterplan, stripping, the band regs counterplan, dicta, and then the DAs?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
The DAs are discon then, the starting decisis though.
Or is it the same 2AC as was originally sent out?
Yes. Anyone not good?
Okay, now,
Runoff from Caicos drives massive hydrogen into the Gulf of Mexico. Regulation current collapse of national ocean ecosystems and forced innovation booms as key to solving imminent collapse of the ag industry, both causing extinction. The dead zone defense is wrong. Yes, dead zones doesn't consume rapidly expanding anthropogenic dead zone scientific consensus indicates extinction is imminent. That's carrying compared to all causes are wrong. Ag runoff is key. High concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus are the main driver of dead zones, but empirics prove that's reverse causal fitting and Carrington. The Gulf is key. Only dead zone that's rapidly expanding. Exponentially scientific consensus indicates extinction is imminent. That's LSU and Carrington. The COVID, the food numbers don't matter because they're not comparable to a mass collapse of U.S. agriculture. Advantage 2. Only rewriting the decision of pork producers can set a precedent that rights and potential limits Goldilocks prevents conservative interference with the state environment statutes for solving paths to preserving certainty in emerging tech industries. This stack term is wrong. Some administrative constraints fine. That is why we have read an ossification scenario. The point is just that when courts can rapidly switch from one end of the spectrum to the other, that's bad for regulatory agencies. The canon fails argument is wrong. Overruling pork producers is key. It blatantly violated CWE preamble. Its hyperdimensional in nature is one of kind. The plan can reverse it by setting in place a binding canon that forces judges to listen to it. That's the Clemens and Brown evidence of T cessation. We meet plan mandated cessation of use of water from cables that discharge pollutants in the water. Counter production means regulation, shielding from injury from external sources. It's seen from management, conservation, restoration, and mitigation. So coming. Temporary means the shield from loss, destruction, injury, regulate, prevent the use from protecting the resource. By countries that maintain its support and existing convert conserving right future availability, protect purpose, regulation, external property, self-purpose, particularly our evidence as an intent highly excluded. And the sex for cases potentially topic most likely issue reasons for us to Afghan eliminate pollution as and topics almost nothing makes innovation possible because everything is affects the uterus topic education. They eliminate every core of the topic of including COB, what is ag, etc. For this limits and ground. We solve a better water pollution topic ensures the course engineers, cyber functional limit states kind of insurance most app, cross counterplans case, and impact turn check and make sure they've ground out finally traceability if there's a small chance when you're into the app or resistance on at least the entire debate which causes substance. They finish now. First is purge both, second is purge the counterplan, third is it links to the net benefit because it does massive environmental regulations which trigger the link. The counterplan is logically incoherent. There's two scenarios of the status quo for cables. If they're polluting or if they're not polluting, either they're polluting or they're not. Either they're polluting, the plan says if they're polluting, they cannot exist because they're not polluting. Sorry, the counterplan is just like.
This is an explanation for whom the fellowship in one area.
This is an explanation from the term is just like the counterplan is obviously just plan plus. Second is that the first two links are contradictory, obviously cannot exist. Obviously cannot exist. Third is that you cannot prove that cables exist without permitting, which means that none of these regulations solve. Only permitting prevents cables from not performing a line ground. EPA must have information make ongoing decision regulating cables. Obviously facility even exists whether it discharge pollution that passer violates permit applicability depend on universal permitting. No one can occupy unknown CAFOs. Discharges unknown water pollutants. It fundamentally cannot solve advantage 3 because the court case was not about banning CAFOs, but if they do more extrapolation, we'll answer it because there's just no coherent reason for why any of their planks stop, group the food planks, I'll answer them one by one here. The sustainable irrigation plank fails. It's not a coherent reason why farmers would live. There's not a coherent reason for why farmers would listen. If it's incentives that fails because it causes industry capture. Williams State financial assistance programs are voluntary, no provision made for programs of those that are not like suits are available. Yes, they continue to receive funding through their programs like the failure to except for rule plan the lesson here is that when push comes to shove, federal agencies will not be able to hold their own without influence of directing involvement, at least the possibility of litigation. The agricultural R&D plank fails. Not a question of whether tech exists, rather whether farmers will adopt it. There's no incentive to adopt a more cleaner or more water efficient tech than the status quo because farmers won't have to internalize the cost of their inefficiencies regardless. The constructed wetlands plank fails. It causes disease warming and cancel hydroxy. -19. Extensive wetland construction breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other diseases. Construction wetlands land intensive treating methane most effective. That's for warming method. Wetlands produce more 1/4 anaerobic decomposition. Organic matter wetlands are able to share toxic water, wastewater, and construction wetlands are the status quo. They don't solve any better. Now all to keep construction wetlands are being used to treat wastewater for concentrated livestock operations. Analysis indicating the number of pollutants for liveable livestock. Wastewater removed and about the same rate other wastewater types. Plank about producing non-meat alternatives doesn't solve because it's about food export to other countries. There's and it's about like grain and agriculture. There's not a reason why like producing more producing more vegetarian meat would like solve. The ag programs like doesn't solve. There's no incentive to adopt it. Shown above, as explained above, the restoration of floodplain stuff. You can crossline all the stuff from the constructed wetland stuff. This obviously does not solve dead zones. It's not enough to overcome the amount of pollution that they create, and they're already at worst they're already implementing status quo. The CAFO's unethical stuff. You should defer to UTIL. It's the most ethical. It's the most ethical. Plus, like if we win, then they cancel. Obviously, doesn't matter. You can have a UTIL debate if you want. The stripping counter. First is perm to both. Second is perm to counter the judiciary results and impacts the epidemic because it's about a runaway court. Third is that doesn't solve the ossification impact. Some court interference is good because the whole the agency to pass decisions maintaining and balances key for Sorensen Nielsen. That's the court doesn't solve the climate's impact or admin state impact. The counterplan only strips jurisdiction to review regulation. That statute's course will limit the scope of it. Statute to regulate environmental regulation doesn't solve patents either. Stripping jurisdiction is bad because courts need to be able to review patents, so the counterplan doesn't search the sector at all. So it needs to solve the ban regulations of CAFO's play. A counterplan. First is perm to the most. Second is perm to the counterplan. Third is that it can't solve the link terms because the link terms are premised on the status quo being inherently unsustainable because they don't have to internalize the cost of the regulation to take the counterplan. Perm to both, perm to the counterplan, and perm to the plan, and have the court rule and clarify that it's non-binding. It's not intrinsic because it includes the plan and the counterplan is non-binding canon. It's not severance because it does the entire plan in the part of the counterplan that expressly makes the canon non-binding. Following counterplans are bad, so the applicant runs toward the top of controversy. I think that is non-retroactive, so the counterplan doesn't make sense either. Counterplan says that in past cases the old rule applies, but in future case past laws unreliable. Pork producer's case was decided a decade ago, so the counterplan would affirm that instead of the plan. Allowing independently counterplan leaving out to the lower courts also fails because that's just the status quo. So this is left out of the lower courts for the past 30 years. Pork producers was a district court case, and lower courts won't follow it. Level 06. Supreme Court think that someone assert that things are different. Someone types ordering lower court should particular Supreme Court controlling hours by the court. Supreme Court think and all of the adjudicate when if your report is issue about it. May not treat Supreme Court think someone possessive dispossessive. Must adjudicate lower court's constitutional responsibility deciding in accordance with law, different law and links in that benefit. It's bad for rule of law. Can name 13 regular rule laws like this no big law making by subdivision only later on follow judicial opinions and mirrors like the first laws that occur no controversy to establish procedure given that all judges agree that being clear passage that you must also include this not the law attention between federal law and rule law as it have guided this habit to short to long consensus the rule law comes in it's a subsequent judges determining the law to be consistent with a rule law judges should ensure that lawmaking of only a priority Supreme Court should not resort to these facts. It's not the same. First is that the dissents on the what is ruling from last August stumps and the industries in doubt. But now, Pack 16 EPs, which all words were released, farmers and doubts whether they're required to plan for permanently water for destruction, pillage, and poultry litter review to EP would reveal large people would like that obligation. Second is that Biden thumbs their environmental rights. Now, third is that the app makes the industry sustainable. A few reasons. First, the pollution linked to clean water is a prerequisite that always the neg. This is the late Guideline 16. Who does depend on water as leading cause of water impairment, runoff from primary source of pollution from deaths under the house that pollutes. EPA rules are important. Something to be taken into worse knowledge medication. These are even better farmer. Argues regulation and cost. Farmers are seawater quality distribution not to be dealt with on a low opposition as a result of our campaign openness. They were troubled. Now media hosting the war and habitat effects. Second is the innovation link to declining innovation makes ag cost impossible. It's the any evidence and disproves the link in internal link and outweighs it. 2021 the financial impact is the exemptions will fail for regular solution of social media average. Insurance food is really below any experts disagree regarding exemption law industry or some of the cost of regulation innovation competition for maximizing purposes. They'll take advantage of innovation with seeing the conflict with economic rationality or religion cause innovation regarding incentives and investing in tech are no longer accepted. Environmental regulation innovation become positive out of revenues greater than compliance costs and sustainable ag link turn actually I'm not gonna read that. This one or
No, go to the next slide. You have like 40 seconds left.
sure. The sorry, yes, I just said. First is that there's zero unique use for any links to the plans. Godus has adopted this interpretive approach for decades. Plan just clarifies the nature of the canon and make it binding and effective. Second is that it's not unique. There are dozens of other binding canons that already exist and constitute the bulk of how courts determine claim construction. And the third is that there's no risk of leak. The act doesn't be automatic for how judges approach statutory construction. Stack 19. An active purpose represents a point agreement between textuals and purposes. Approach purposes should have no objection taken seriously and act the same and purpose and being mounted on canon clearly reflects the purpose of purposes of judges agree that adherence to canon to provide the best way of courts to adhere. Right card here, there's no impact to democracy.
Say it all causes democracy.
Tons of all cause democracy, Trump gerrymandering elections, all etc. All done, but there's also no escalation, no scenario for escalation.
You good?
I'm good.
Okay, first to clarify on the turn on advantage 2, I got the first argument about ossification, and I got the third argument about answering like the defensive cannons. What was the second argument?
I think it was just like optimized ossification is, I don't think there was an argument between the two, it was just like optimized ossification is good. That's like the entirety of the stuff about like.
Okay, how does I guess the AF result in optimized oscillation? That's not good. But yeah, how does the AF result in it?
It's the stack 13 piece of evidence and the second advantage. It says that like making it so that like courts would have to construe like statutes in light of their preamble, aka their enacted purposes, is good. It makes it so that like agencies would not be able to flip flop between interpretation, or like courts would not, like agencies would not.
Wait. How do the courts hold agencies accountable to do that? What about the AF changes the way it exists?
The binding canon, like the binding canon would force courts to make it so that like they would not allow agencies, they would not be allowed to rule that agencies do something like opposite or like that disagrees with what the preamble says. Like they'd be forced to rule in the direction.
It's about the binding nature of the canon. They would like have to follow the text of it.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, so like we think that's like proves or creates predictability for parties because they would not be able to flip flop.
Okay,
They have to rule
like
in line.
that. I get the argument you're going for. I want to ask UTIL first on the Ankefos counter plan. Who's included in UTIL?
We think
animals?
we should maximize human lives.
Human lives. So no animals are considered, like ever.
Well, we think that like human lives should come first. Like
Human lives come first. Do we
extinction
ever?
risks outweigh like CAFOs existing, but like at worst like we resolve
Also,
this because
Extinction would kill all animals.
Okay. I mean, to be fair, that requires money like an exchange. But all right. So
Sure.
we never
Not
consider
human lives.
animal lives in the world of UTIL.
well we think that like extinction outweighs.
Okay, but it's to be clear, extinction of human lives. Animals not considered.
Sure.
Sure.
I
Awesome.
think that, yeah, like
Like
Um,
you can win animals matter and we still win that impact framing debate. Like
What you said?
you can win animals matter and we still win the impact framing debate because like extinction would kill all animals in
All right,
CAFOs plus all animals everywhere plus all humans. So, like,
All right, I'm psyched about that impact framing debate. The scripting counter plan, what's the terminal impact to, I'm trying to think what the name of the deficit was. Oh, the patents, how does the counter plan not solve it?
we've read an impact, we've like, are you asking like what the terminal impact to patents is or like what the
Yeah,
deficit
just the internal link by the counter plan would solve it.
Well, we think that can't solve patents because like courts are good for reviewing patents. We've read terminal impacts to patents.
Where courts were good for reviewing patents.
Like
that's the only way a patent gets approved. Like if you ban the courts from being involved in the patent process altogether by stripping jurisdiction, they're just not. This isn't
Okay,
patent
wait,
system
to be
anymore.
clear, patents, those are tied to, oh, wait, yeah, okay, that makes sense. The purview of the counter plan explanation, how,
for
Okay, we'll take a little bit of that. Start that What floor was Condo on?
It didn't say content.
I'm cool. I was scared for a second.
9:20.
Okay.
Just wanted to make sure, because I figured what you said,
I thought I also
and,
missed
like,
it.
I didn't hear it, so I was like.
I told Brandon to put content into AC because you said you could kick all the planks, but like. Oh well.
Damn. Now we're kicking so many plays.
We're about to kick, yeah. No, I was
Okay.
just about to say.
Y'all know we were never gonna go for condo.
Huh?
We're not cowards, we're not going for condo.
Come on.
Sometimes going for condo is like, sometimes you gotta.
Condo is what equal to power.
Yeah, but like
Yeah.
condo 2NRs are just like nice.
Did you say condo 2NRs are nice?
Yeah, I kind of if like I don't.
2NR?
It's nice when like the 2NR ends and they're like it's condo, because that's just like whatever. Obviously, it's not fun to like do the condo part of the 2NR. I think I'm probably unique in that way.
I can hear Gabe dropping our speaks every time Melissa opens her mouth.
Yeah, honestly.
Do whatever you want. I'm on the street.
Our speaks were not going to be high in this round anyways. Should have read the weed out.
We had so much to say.
That app was a mess.
Yeah.
Do you think you'll read it like in the future though, maybe?
I don't know.
Hopefully.
I cut it in like August, and then I didn't want to cut another app, so
That's
just
impressive.
edited it.
That's just like fair.
Yo, shit, bro. I don't plan to create that. Is the doc sent or is it just?
Yeah.
No card policy to MC.
I have genuinely done that before.
Speak from the heart.
Oh, wait, it's a joke? Oh.
I was like, I have.
The order is T, the ban regulation counterplan, the dicta counterplan, the ban papers counterplan.
Yo, yeah.
There's no way that was gonna work. Go ahead.
T,
Calculating.
I got that.
ban regulation counterplan.
Sorry, is this the uniqueness counterpoint from Biscon?
Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
That's just basically what I know.
The dicta.
One liner.
Yeah. The dicta counterplan. The ban CAFOs counterplan. Invented one. But just the death zones part.
What was in between, from the doc, it seems like it won't matter, but like, what was in between T and the ban counterplan?
The other two counterplans. Or not the jurisdiction one. The ban regulations counterplan.
So that's also an ethics violation. You just
No, I just see like, I see that there's a T other ban counterplan.
Yeah, actually, new order. Ethics violation at the top.
Joking.
Oh. I am.
actually okay. Ben, the order you gave is the T cessation, the ban, the with uniqueness counterplan.
Yeah.
The dicta counterplan, the ban CAFOs multi-plank advantage counterplan. Advantage one, where he would be answering the dead zone stuff.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Anyways,
That was so cheap.
Oh,
this is gonna go great.
Okay, I'm good.
Shit. All right.
Everyone good?
That's going.
Cool. On
20 will concede the protection means regulations they don't meet that the plan increases permitting and monitoring. The monitoring part is extra-topical. That explains them. As monitoring apps are entirely new category of apps that no court generics predicated off of regulation like based on the market mechanism counterplans. It makes apps such as test degrees of pollution for research purposes topical, which are impossible to answer air and to be destructively biased towards the app. Water protection is objectively a good idea, and we don't have a mechanism force agent specification, meaning that we don't even get politics. Apps have a strategic incentive to score whatever ground the neg does have, which makes a little talk with the specific case and unified generics only viable internally to garner and clash independently extra topicality is a voter because incentivizes teams reading infinitely unpredictable and non-topical beats of offense and spiking DAs and solvency deficits with non-topical mechanisms forces to win on T and substance, which is an impossible burden on the ban regulation counterplan. We're kicking the counterplan that printers to test a computational offense on the flow on the data counterplan, same thing. We're kicking no offense on the flow, printers to test a competition theories of reason reject the argument on the team on the ban cables counterplan. The counterplan sells from 100% of the apple when disadvantage of the cables are incredibly unethical and unnecessary. They don't treat animals as sentient, confine them to space in which there's not enough space to move or sit down and mutilate the animals, etc. That's all AWI no date. They've conceded the fact that CAFOs are extremely unethical and all that internally debating, which means that if we win an impact that's completely unmitigated, it comes first and outweighs the entire app. That's best. 7. Human animal nerve exploitation intently interconnected fundamental logic impression species and ideologies of objectification evaluation and exclusion and there are profound relationships between species and the race system animal and human exploitation mass animals suffering human genocide and new awareness is a survival of our endangered planet that is reacting represents more failure to respond to the enormity of animal suffering and intellectual failure to understand the implications of the attempt to shut subject colonize and plunder that besides the species suffering animal suffering is not more a response to this pursuits of an atomistic enabled into the state of the connection between animal exploitation, environmental destruction, patriarchy, racism, violence, and world hunger. We should stop treating animal rights and turf human environmental problems and see it as a fundamental to resolving crisis in both. Independently will concede that only the plan prevents industrial collapse. That's inevitable because of declining efficiency. Transition to sustainable farming now is key and solves a laundry list of existential threats and global food crises. That's at 20. Catastrophic decline in pollinators driven by the industrial farming monoculture that accept and fertilizer use, climate change, soil erosion, declining efficiency, fossil fuel, inputs, carbon emission, dangerous industrial ag becoming increasingly expensive manufacturing splitting percent of the global food system cannot feed the world within the current food system, viable system, much more locally oriented, coming global food crisis and providing industrial systems. Default is efficiency framing the deficit need and terminal impact and judging with they win offense or perm do both is either mutually exclusive or links to that benefit. The alpha increases permitting monitoring. The counterplan ceases both. The counterplan severs permitting. It means allowing. That's dictionary.com.aid. Permitting to allow to do something. The counterplan increases. The counterplan ceases permitting while the plan substantially increases it. That's obviously mutually exclusive. Independently, independently, the counterplan view. Independently, there's also a net benefit on monitoring because the counterplan sees it while the plan increases it. Biden's EPA solves chemical pollution now. That's INJ 21. The Biden EPA regulate chemicals that bioaccumulate, make a reversal from Biden developers is protecting the possible APAs seeking public input on alternative measures. Monitoring would trade off that's good 20. EPA enforces testing laws including the water pollution, the waste dumps, air pollution, and chemicals in the EPAs. Providing limited oversight from the agency, different priorities. Not all functions can be performed without spreading too thin. Chemical accumulation causes extinction. That's Profit 21. And if human coming soon, I think the chemicals doesn't fertility use for accounts 50% every year by 2045 PFAS. Forever chemicals are averaging breaking point. Reproductive careers can continue to global existential crisis. PFAS literally confusing our bodies. It doesn't link to that benefit because that benefit isn't BISCOM, which was what their link was about. The thing about not solving first the precedent advantage. It definitely does. The company rules on the exact same precedent as the affirmative, but instead of substantially increasing permitting monitoring, PFAS instead ceases both those as a justification from the purpose of the CWA, which saves off mass harm against animals while replicating their precedent. The Brown evidence they agree to quote descriptive and Kaplan definitely solves that warrant. we definitely solved the pollution scenario. Banning PFAS means that they can't pollute, obviously, but the dead zone splitting solves anyways. That's the Adam 7's mandates sustainable agricultural practices like cover crops and reduce tillage, crop rotation through nutrient management, which reduces nutrient runoff and independently sets up restoring floodplains and captures nutrients, which stops them from getting to dead zones. We're keeping the farmers do have to listen to their regulations because it's a mandate. The groves have evidence is about one prior rule from 2008. The company has mandated not incentives, which answers the next two parts. We'll kick the constructed wetlands plank. The campaign solves the second, the agricultural advantage too. First is an investment in food capacity abroad. That's 100 sevens, which says that increasing international support for grain reserves and domestic production in the countryside. Import from the U.S. solves because it reduces dependence on U.S. imports, which solves their scenario. Their internally evidence says that a food security strategy solves. Where green insert that re-highlighting what I see Kessel only the campaign solves because every crisis are inevitable in the status quo. Only building resilience through R&D solves, but the internally can litany of all causes. It's good. 1230. And also saying that given the population growth, only American capital for drug probably arises with the natural disasters and urbanization, changing because of private evidence, recent pollution and pollution that exists in the investment no match for track best for building resilience investments in R&D substantially increase yields at a low cost of investment disease and increase tolerance to drive solution huge return on investment benefit cost ratio for research 1.3 to 1 to 1 R&D currently under investment agricultural research is a secret weapon of diverting food crisis. There's no card that's actually saying that we won't adopt those R&D things. Obviously, companies would adopt them if they are good for the output of the company. Second is that non-industrial industrial animal farming solves. That's accurate. 21. There's nothing to suggest that the present without PFAS, independent producers have always been able to expand production and given an economic incentive that there are new non-PFAS means of producing animal products already becoming competitive with PFAS. It would be even more competitive with added research and development, market card, development. Third is that labbing is ready. Financing is the key. That's shooter 19. Meat made from cultivated animal cells. Has always been the cost of manufacturing facilities are bringing down the cost of production down to $10 per pound. Significant cost reduction makes live ground meat commercially viable sooner than anyone expected with new financing tested scale. That results if no impact algae blooms or dead zones that their coral migrants and seagrass are all able to create oxygenic microhabitats that counter deoxygenation and resulting in widespread species adaptation. That's ulterior and sewage and fertilizer dumping. Fossil fuel usage and warming are the biggest drivers of dead zone creation. That the Afghan solve, which is Bloomberg evidence for an issue. Literally none of their evidence, their cards given impact. No evidence high species extinction. In dead zones, 2 human extinction. All the cards reference extinction, but it's talking about mass extinctions of species, not not humans, which doesn't access their impact. Their inevitable naturally occurring. That's Lewis 07. Mass fish kills with algae blooms have been reported for hundreds of years. They are natural events that naturally occurring in the Baltic Sea since the last ice age. Dead zones are anthropogenic. Newest studies that's got all 21. Recent studies have just been processed provide besides that of the anthropogenic water chiefly responsible for deoxygenation, the isotopic data suggests a nutrient source of and oxide zones of marine origin. Mark credit working. Do you want those 2 cards marked?
There we go.
I don't care.
Okay. You good?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's start on the counterplan. The policy counterplan text. Do some clarification. What is the distinction between the first plank and the plan?
What is the distinction between the first plank and the plan?
Yep.
What do you mean?
Like, why is this not
There's
just,
different.
is this not just, like, what is this, like, why is this not just the AF?
The AF increases permitting. The first plank of the counterplan requires that if, like, it says that if a CAFO doesn't have a permit, then it can't operate. Those are just like, one is about whether CAFOs are allowed to operate if they don't have a permit. One is about whether we are increasing permits in monitoring. But like, those aren't related. The plan closes exemptions in the CWA for CAFOs to increase regulation under the CWA. The plank of the counterplan says that if they don't have a permit, then they're not allowed to operate.
Okay, sure. The first plank says that they require permits. The second plank says to cease permitting. How do those exist at the same time?
The first plank says that if they don't have a permit, they're not allowed to operate. The second plank says that we don't give them permits. The effect of that is essentially a ban because no CAFOs would have permits.
Require permits in all instances and then don't give permits.
It says that if CAFOs don't have permits, then they're not allowed to operate, and then it says don't give permits.
Okay.
Okay, sure. I guess like the stuff about, I guess like at what point would they be required to obtain a permit, like related to the first one?
Their existence is required to obtain a permit. I don't know. Like, I mean, I'm not really sure what the question is. It's like the effect of the 2 points is that they're not allowed to operate because they don't have permits.
Okay, that's fine.
And that's distinct from increasing permits.
The stuff about precedent, or actually, let's talk about the T interpretation. The stuff about regulations. I guess like what card has said that like we must it can only be regulations.
Do you want me to read the tag of your T card?
I mean, Circumbe says we need to regulate or prevent conflicting uses from
Okay.
affecting the resource.
The card may say that. The tag of your interpretation says protection means regulations shielding from industry from shielding from injury from external sources.
Why is
We
the
conceded the
not
counter
shielding from
interpretation.
injury?
Can you give me an example of a regulation that doesn't involve monitoring?
Well, we think that regulations are distinct from monitoring. We think that
Okay, sure. What-
enforcement of regulations might involve monitoring in
So
some
topical
instances.
apps have to implement regulations, but are not allowed to enforce them.
You can't. We think that topical apps are not allowed to fiat external parts of like. I mean, the plain text says monitoring. We think that topical apps are allowed to like establish the regulation itself.
What really quickly, what card has said, or like what card have you conceded that says regulations has to be like regulations cannot be monitoring?
I mean, if you read a card that says monitoring is a regulation, then like sure we can have that debate. I think otherwise it's pretty obviously not.
Your burden to prove that?
Okay, the webinar is sent, it's gonna be the starting decisis DA, the BizCon DA, the jurisdiction stripping counter plan, advantage 2, advantage 1, where I will repeat this, the excerpt.
Start Cisis, BizCon, or the stripping. Advantage 2, advantage 1.
Yes. Great, can you read this up?
So you said DA's court stripping.
Yeah, that, then advantage 2, advantage 1.
Wait, 2-1 or 1-2?
2, 1.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, get down. Anyone not ready? The story decides DA concede no links to your uniqueness for the DA not going for it is gone. Concede thumb first the impact which nullifies the link term because it proves that the impact won't happen. Jurisdiction stripping here. The counterpoint provides uniqueness for the term in case null the first advantage, and solves null the first advantage because it does the regulations that you have without the precedent. The second advantage is that avoids any one of your arguments that would make about the status quo being uncertain for agencies, and experiments as Congress will be able to leverage his power over court stripping to stop them from regulating agencies. They say perm to both one, perm to both links to that benefit when established the precedent. The plan text specifies means durable fiat needs to be upheld. Second, the plan text has to be coerced. They include justification in their plan text. They branch in the courts including justifications of voter rights, politics links, or VA links by fiating on individual Congress people. The executive justify the plan. The court president is distinct because the president is predicated off of justification. 3, they also specify their courts. Brown 11 about how future courts should clarify which is their solvency advocate. We read when I see Brown 11 and the court defending the CWA should do so whether the ex purpose position no competition is good. And using highlighted portions of what I see solvency advocate solves their offense because evidence they choose to read but plan states alone is bad. Let's see how articulate the apps super vaguely despite kind of flank state. Say perm to both, but perm to the counter plan, but perm to the counter plan suffers precedent. The app line, the app to separate portions of the plan text is massively unfair. The comments of the administrative state that solvency deficit solves the counter plan solves the administrative state. The circumstances of Congress stripping the quarterly building limit agency review is sufficient to shoot them from protecting limit agencies in the future. The patents deficit we solve patents agencies will be able to issue them which their innovation evidence says is good. They don't have an impact by judicial review, not agency review is key. Advantage 2. We've internally turned the precedent unit to recode when AC documents as the enacted purpose can includes agency interpretation that may have previously been passed but limits the range of agency actions that we consider for deference, which overall decreases deference to agencies. It turns all their offense, it's predicated off of agency flexibility. The so our purposes of Chevron deference, HLR 17, purposes of managing judicial power that refusing to step up on recognizing judicial clarity in the court road, policy conduct of the right of us interpretation for result in that Congress when something else is definitely less more robust judicial role, oftentimes the judiciary faces receive from an agency to plan and interpret their powers for judicial Chevron's arguable way of being Congress or Congress respective purposes and its encouragement Chevron or reserve special treatment for major cases of purposes of general purposes and poses significant cost just as choosing methodology based on predicate in cases to them and have them on the space of their pursuit outcome. Oscillation argument doesn't matter if they're because it assumes they're winning that they increase agency discretion. Recode the 1AC documents as the role of the act reduces agency discretion from its scope, massively shifting in favor of the court, which we both agree is that the other argument on this flow is that the canon does work, but canon fails to rein in judges. That's proven. Canons being durable doesn't solve anything because they have doesn't solve anything because they abstracts different instances of canons being brought up by justice and interpreting them in different ways. It means that even if they make those canons binding, justice will just interpret them in a way that's interpret them in a way that is favorable to their opinions. Canons are non-binding. Right? 11. Of course, I've read the construction service guiding principles for interpreting the statute canon or supplying default statute required. Our rules have necessarily fairly applied to judgment declined to interpret a statute requirements of the given canon. Judges can ignore canons like 14 canons are exact same experience, but not includes a consideration for basic contrary evidence. Canons are it's not only but or only not rules allowed certain by Congress that is helping to formulate a resolution that should over active canons limit utilities and standalone methods to construction judges take circumstances into account. Canons are over the rules of thumb. Advantage 1. Their ag impact is zero risk. First is slumbers and day 20 COVID-19 both cause massive food shocks and force countries to severely limit their exports. The fact that they can trigger their impact proves no break. The only 2 easy answer to this is that it wasn't sufficient, but they don't establish a bright line for when ag shocks are enough, which means you should have a extremely high threshold for them winning this impact. COVID climate and conflict block and long-term food insecurity. BB21 because you face food insecurity versus engaged in conflict natural causes common impacts. COVID impacts continue throughout 2020 beyond this delta spread rates from 30% higher risk at the country level. Second is more economic populations can't fight, they can't sustain operations. So 14, the conflict of violence during care secrecy for to maintain their rate of more difficult to sustain their operations under distress, and food price increases won't cause war and peers. Speaker 11, hunger shortages are covered in sub-Saharan countries such as Malawi, Zimbabwe, intensity of wars involving them are not the Dust Bowl caused by deprivation when their civil war, while temperatures have been rising steadily in Africa the past 15 years. Civil wars and war deaths have been followed by pressure access to labor and loss issues with the war price also going to be organized in our benefits on the influence of bad governments, close economies, and militant ideologies, availability and regression of armed conflicts, and using the conflict more likely if the country was formed after it suffered from drought shortages and aggregation, really analysis in a large number of countries that have been cherry picking, including those who foresee because of scarcity and conflict and little support. 3. Castle doesn't make an extinction claim, just the ag shortages cause small civil skirmishes. They have to read an impact of civil wars, so we're going to get terminal impact off of that. 4. Countries that matter for their impact are resilient institutional responses for installations. Plus 16. Current research is not indicated clearly between food insecurity and conflict. Many countries face food crisis. Research shocks without following the conflict factors to resilience over the food insecurity cover with other stress would be too simplistic to suggest that the primary term of the country's an institution providing health to citizens of the country. The OA person development country research or protests of the difference in Haiti versus Mexico, the Philippines, institutional strength exists with food shocks not for deteriorating national security. 5. Global response to food insecurity can effectively prevent conflict gas. And 17. President for President OH told the global leaders that policy regarding food insecurity initiative. Work hard at food security initiative.
Like 720.
722.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're on.
Yeah.
Or actually, just going to train first. You should be like, you should read the cost of the car.
These kind of- Okay. 322.
Okay, so here's the message by Dave.
It covers something. Very interesting.
Okay. Send out cards. Okay. One of your cards should be sent. Order is first advantage, second advantage, T, court stripping counterplan, the industry DA, and then the ban counterplan.
Could you run into that?
Yeah. First advantage,
Yeah.
second advantage, T,
For sure.
court stripping counterplan,
Uh-huh.
industry DA.
Like this one?
Yeah, sorry, this con. Ban counterplan slash.
Yeah.
Anybody not good to go?
No COVID all cause. 21 promise of the first president showers after the torture dreams system came back life didn't break but did lunch and tries to be worse the purpose when talking about COVID is very survivability. We did maybe looking next time. The impact defense is wrong. All other evidence is about empirical disruption doesn't assume the total collapse of use effectively next because of climactic pressures. Yes, nuclear escalation. Clark evidence is to draw countries to nukes even if great powers are resilient. Even if great powers are resilient, smaller countries aren't, and great powers that interest in those circumstances like impact defense. The second image. The turn to the top is wrong. The recounting says that the actually constrains agencies by binding them to the text of statutes. In order for your turn to have an impact, in order for your turn to turn the advantage, they have to win. That agencies have to deviate from the statute in order to solve any of our impacts. All of our evidence is that adhering to statutes and preambles is sufficient. There is no impact to this, even if we wreck Chevron. That's not key to solving the for impact. See, the canon defense is wrong. All this assumes the status quo of the plan. This just sometimes justices can reinterpret things as they see fit. It doesn't matter because the plan fiats that they use a certain justification for doing so. Stare decisis means to be applied in the future. All agreements from 2008, not about the app. It is assuming the status quo. The T argument. We meet. Please make this the two in R. Please make this the two in R. There's no regulation doesn't involve some sort of monitoring because regulations are just when the government requires compliance with some sort of measures. If regulations do not include this, then their interpretation of the topic is that we have to fiat regulations with their compliance. Explain. You can only vote on this if you can explain how regulations work without compliance and monitoring. We just specified in the plan because we're nice. Stripping kind of plan. Permutation do both. Doesn't matter if we specify the court because the kind of plan reigns in the judiciary, which is the terminal effect of the turn. So it solves the turn. It doesn't solve any of it. Doesn't solve any of the third. It doesn't solve any of the second image versus ossification. Stopping regulations is precisely the point. Argument is that some intervention is necessary in order to get agencies to stick to their word and establish certainty. Also doesn't solve the statutes. It doesn't solve statutes. The Clemens evidence says the courts will destroy statutes. The kind of only strips jurisdiction to review agency interpretations, which does not solve the Clemens evidence. Third is it doesn't solve the patents argument. That MBA just sort of asserts that the agency can issue them. No, the random evidence is great and says that the courts need to be involved because it's the only way to ensure patent process is certain and key to investment. Yeah, the BizCon TA. This is the DA to the ban counterplan, but not the app. We conceded in this way see that the ag industry is key to the overall economy. The counterplan bans cables, but the plan doesn't because it narrowly regulates them and it's good for the industry. This means that it is an impact turn and causes extinction because the plan does not collapse the economy, but the counterplan definitely does because it gets rid of the whole industry because it bans it. Yeah, ban counterplan. The best part of the top is wrong. It says that it says that cables are part of a logic. It says cables are part of a logical elimination. The counterplan alone does not solve that. Anthropic extinction at ways. At the bottom of the 2AC, the Ahmed evidence is wrong. We solve it because we cause a shift to sustainable farming practices. Because we cause a shift to sustainable farming practices. No reason total collapse is key. Permutation to both the app says the government requires a permit if the cable is found to be polluting. Counterplan says require a permit if the cable exists. Logically, if the cable is polluting, it also exists. So this is entirely plan plus. The permitting part is not about environmental policy. It's about permitting in the general sense for the Brown evidence and the YC defines it in the context of environmental regulations. But if they're right about their definitions, and the counterplan is worse for the net benefit because it expands CAPOs because it requires permits for everything. If they're correct about their definition of permitting, then logically the counterplan expands CAPOs because it permits all of their existence. The PFAS TA, screw you, I'm a straight turn it. Permits are going through CAPOs without permits, forces the EPA to pursue endless fact-finding missions, which drain resources permitting is less expensive than McLaren evidence, civil suits, logic, scale enforcement actions pursuant to the agreeable, sure, norms, financial, and political pressure script as well. To arrive complex at the end of the EPA should pursue account the operation for the regular civil and administrative corporate action based on how much accusing the CIC governing information people who have determined self-supervised person to comply after the diversity can pursue comparisons from structure with consumption cases to as much risk to companies as every young effects for the pressure of the shape these sort of survival with states of number person actions against CAPOs. Permitting is key. Banning it fails because CAPOs won't choose to apply for permit. They know that it'll just result in them not existing. Middle regard is key. This Brown. In a lot of the instructional terms, these central operators and the incentive apply for the operation of the government for pollution issues, ability to take out the operations to initial violation cannot require facilities to rebuild their existence for the attack of questions, practical importance, interpretation, carries broad application, or ability to regulate cases does not solve the third advantage. Brown just sort of asserts it does because it does the same thing as the plan. That is wrong. The text of the Clean Water Act says regulate discharge. If the courts were to insert their own meaning to it and say that the phrase regulate discharge means banning CAPOs altogether, it would look completely ridiculous because it would be the courts inserting their own meaning. The whole point of the third advantage is that the court should adhere to what Congress says is key. If the courts insert their own meaning into the text of the statute, it logically does not solve the second advantage.
Say that it says the counterplan text is permitting, the plan says pre-discharge permitting.
Counterplan says permitting, plan says pre-discharge permitting. The other plans on the back are wrong. The nutrient runoff argument is the status quo. The Tuesday court does answer. It says that the CAPOs are trying to do this now, but modern pollutants are so bad because they include things like APR, so it doesn't solve the agricultural strategy does not matter because you can't export food to other countries if it does not exist. The plan is a prerequisite to the counterplan working. The resiliency and R&D arguments do not solve it because they do not solve it. There's no incentive to adopt new technologies because the exemptions from the Clean Water Act subsidize them. Music have to take into account the cost of revolution. There's no incentive to reduce pollution altogether. Bans do not solve it because the counterplan does not effectively ban it. The meat lab argument is wrong. No evidence that we're exporting it to other countries, and your evidence says it's decades off. So quick transition wars. even if you're correct about meat in the future, doesn't solve the short.
9 minutes and 20 seconds. That's
How many? How long?
9 minutes and 20 seconds.
I.
Okay, start that. No.
Have you seen that in Delmar where it's like water under the bridge? She's shrinking. But like it's United style and it's the mystery. It's a classic. I just see it's like. Yeah, hopefully they don't lose. I never forget that. I think that doesn't happen. See where the shit was sent. So like Ukraine, taking a picture of us.
Realizing residents do the whole point. Like if you eventually get that course, political justice, that is true. Technically, regulates discharges from cables.
Oh,
And that discharges means we can make a certain kind of contact.
security. So that's an external thing that's like agencies being able to interpret central laws code. Then you have but the fact that Plaid is an anti-shadow doesn't mean anything. Because agencies interpret things that the law does not mean anything.
Okay, I'm not gonna take the extras.
Oh, that's.
Yours, T.
My bad. Also, NDT? What? NDT? Who's one just said, like, I should send you congratulations?
Oh, thank you so much.
Plus, he just heard.
Okay, so the order is topicality, just described to me?
Yep.
Sounds good. Roll that out.
One thing about Brendan Moore's shower. It's because I wouldn't tell you what my key card is. I've been saving the whole year.
You don't get it, it's just.
Shockingly, there are no cards. My computer's so slow. No, it's getting there. It's just scrolling up in a dock, but like not really scrolling up.
Is it?
There we go. Okay. Set the timer for 5 minutes. I don't believe we'll be needing all 5.
Wow, we're that confident already.
I mean, there's not too many arguments.
That's true.
Okay.
I'm not sure why Ben blows this argument off in the 1ER so much. All I have to note is that their interp excludes monitoring, which means that they're extra topical. They've conceded that extra topicality is a voter since it allows apps to garner infinite, unpredictable offense and new non-topical advantages, while also letting them spike links to DAs and solvency deficits to the app. That forces 2 hours on T and substance, which is an untenable burden that's not reciprocal and makes being neg impossible. They have conceded that, which means that if we win that they're extra T, then you vote neg. There are 2 dropped framing issues that matter. First is that they've conceded that you should massively air neg on this topic because there are no unique DAs. Water protection is objectively a good idea. The topic is agent agnostic, meaning we don't even get procedural arguments like politics and prep, and the app has structural biases like infinite prep and speaking first and last. That means that we need all that we can get to rectify these the sort of structural and topical unfairness on the topic. They have dropped a massive limit here, which means that you should air neg on the question of including monitoring in the topic because we are winning reasons why including monitoring is bad. It allows apps to do the research app where they just research and test the amount of and monitor the amount of pollutants in water, or go to a CAFO and monitor the amount of polluting that they're doing. That expands the research, the literature base to an entirely new section of the topic and is able to spike links to DAs. Our offense on extra T is specifically true in the context of monitoring. They read 1ER cards about monitoring being key because we don't even know how many CAFOs there are, which should be a negative solvency argument in this debate. They dropped that we should get solvency. They shouldn't be allowed to spike out of solvency deficits to the app because on the sort of impact level of extra T. This is an example of them doing that because by including monitoring in the debate. T is a question of framing issue. We've conceded their interp. T is a question of the interp. All of their arguments about monitoring is involved in the process of regulation, or monitoring is related to regulation, or the EPA monitors when after it does regulations, don't meet their interp, because the text of their interp says that protection requires regulations. The text of the resolution says that apps need to substantially increase protection of water resources, which means that apps need to substantially increase regulation. Increases in regulation do not mean increases in monitoring. Increase in regulation means that it's an increase in the actual penalties, just the regulation itself. The regulation itself does not include monitoring. That is a distinct part of how the EPA enforces regulations. Their argument about getting to you can't fiat regulations without fiating compliance is a little bit absurd. I'm not really sure what they mean. Obviously, you don't fiat compliance. Monitoring isn't compliance anyways, because monitoring is just a distinct thing that the EPA does. It's not even involved in regulation. In the context of CAFOs, all of their evidence talks about we go to CAFOs to see how much pollution is in the water. That is not involved in that is not a distinctly necessary part of setting a limit on the amount of pollution allowed. That is something that the EPA enforces. The EPA does do that involved in enforcing, but that is not a mandate of regulation under the resolution. You don't get to fiat that. The EPA does that in the status quo. This wouldn't mean that no apps can solve, because obviously the EPA would probably do some sort of monitoring in the enforcement. We don't think that you get to fiat that because we think that takes away things like circumvention arguments and solvency arguments. It's proved by the fact that they increase monitoring. Obviously, that means that there's monitoring in the status quo that is just naturally how much the EPA does. They are independently increasing monitoring because they are making arguments about how that's not enough to solve, which is proved by their deficits to the counterclaim about how there's not enough monitoring. The only other argument on flow is that specifying is nice. You obviously shouldn't get this because being not T is not nice. We've read offense about why specifying in this why reading this in this context is bad. They don't have any other implications why specifying is good. They shouldn't get that new in the 2AR. So you should hold the line on 2AR arguments. The only arguments made in the 1AR are all regulations require compliance monitoring. Fiating regulations without compliance doesn't make any sense, and that specifying compliance is nice. You should hold them to that.
322. Yeah.
No, that's not, don't worry.
That's art. Do you want a card doc?
I think the only card needs your combo, right?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, yeah. They don't mind. Because you have to check and see if people are doing that.
The cyber management did not go well today, bro.
Every is defined in the work regulations. Yeah. Just like, is there anything else about that? Just okay with it. Oh, yeah, the interlink. They said he won't be on. Monitoring. Those are just binding key codes. Like these binding regulations. You would still get this. It's not just beyond it like humans. If the net started counterpart, like do this use notification as normal as regulations. It just looks at the monitoring. So next is just the one that says on prem. Just because verification involves monitoring. Explain how regulation works. This is really basic. Regulations are when the government says you cannot do X. You need to be checking to make sure you cannot do X. Conversations here.
Yeah.
Top level, all of the ranting that Brandon does at the top of the 2-1R about how extra T and the limits and stuff, none of that matters because we're just going for a me here. It is just a yes. This battle just boils down to a yes or no and yes or no question. You just need to read it, Sir Combe, read it to AC counter interpretation after the round. Nobody has defined the word regulation in this debate. Nobody has defined the word regulation in this debate, but the Sir Combe card. The negative has not defined the word regulation in this debate, which means it's just a question of the Sir Combe piece of evidence. Sir Combe says that protect means to regulate or prevent conflicting uses from affecting the resource. Obviously, we meet that. Obviously, we meet that. For the two arguments, first is something about or preventing conflicting uses from affecting the resource. Obviously, obviously, Sir Combe says you have to regulate or prevent conflicting uses from affecting the resource. Even if we do not meet regulate, we meet prevent conflicting uses from affecting the resource. The closest argument they get to answering this is your counter-interpretation in the tag says protection means regulations, shielding from injury from external sources. To answer this, first is that you should obviously read the piece of evidence because if you're just saying counter-interpretations without evidence, doesn't make sense. Second is that protections means regulations, shielding injury from external sources. Shielding injury from external sources must include monitoring. I do not understand how regulations work in a world where they do not include monitoring, and after that increases penalties must have monitoring. Part of the law would include if you do not if it increases penalties and you do not have it as part of the law, obviously this law would not make any sense because it would not crack down on people that do not listen to it. The plain text says monitoring, regs, regulations in general, are when the government says you cannot do X, that they must check if you cannot do X.
the counter interpretation or like the neg interpretation just does not make sense because regulations do not work like that or do not work the way they say they do. 3 minutes.
So let's see.
The arguments about like deficits about monitoring prove you're unfair don't matter. Like we would still get those if the 1AC just fiated regulations and not monitor, or just fiated like their interpretation of regulations and not monitoring. Because the argument is just that like binding laws are key. Obviously, this is not unique between different things.
Yeah,
Else.
if they were like a non-binding counterplan, we still get to say monitoring is key. So this is just like not unique.
If they read a non-binding counterplan, like obviously, like if we get to say things about like binding laws are key, this is like non-unique, not offense for them. This is.
Let's see. Oh yeah. So the example they gave at the top of the left was like increase penalties but don't increase monitoring.
If you increase penalties but don't increase monitoring, like obviously that would.
That is analogous to the F because it requires people to get a permit. We just specified that the EPA checks and makes sure they're following the law.
Sure,
It's analogous to what they said.
Sure, at worst, like their interpretation that it'd be like increasing penalties but not monitoring, people check. That at worst would be equivalent to permitting because permits would just be like, here are these like standards, you have to meet them. Like at worst, we still meet. Like even if you don't buy all the stuff above I did about how like regulations like must include monitoring.
How much should I do?
2 minutes.
Let's see. Give me 30 seconds. I'm gonna just check through my flow. Enter that. And good.
Sure.
Great debate, y'all.
Now, if y'all
You
had
said you
been
didn't
looking
want
up-
to debate this round. This was the closest I could do. Why? Who's that? We can talk about this later. Yeah, we shouldn't do it. Just look good. Oh wait, I'm gonna pack up first.
Yeah.
Everyone this debate got 26.
That's not true.
No.
27s.
What are you doing?
Yeah, like there's been no rush on the ballots. Now I imagine that like all of the rush is about to happen.
Yes,
so like,
like,
do I have any massive time?
I mean, you should take the time you need to decide.
Right. No, of course. But then like, what about feedback? Like,
Oh, I
Yeah.
think you've got time for comments. You can add your comments there.
okay.
I mean, worst comes to worst, we can just like email y'all.
I'll do the
later.
decision and then I'm gonna email the decision.
Yeah, I think generally they let people like go back into the decision, add more comments out.
Yeah, I just didn't know this.
The 2 AR has ended.
See.
So y'all have any more tournaments after this, other than like MBA and TOC?
End the stream.
Oh, yeah.
No one is watching this stream.
Also, it was just